In a recent study in 2015, the scientists found remains of biotic life in a few historic rocks, Western Australia, which dated back to 4.1 billion years ago, and on July 2016, the scientists confirmed about 355 genes which were from LUCA of all the living organisms on Earth. Formation, change and loss of species through the evolutionary antiquity of life on Earth are validated by common sets of biochemical and morphological traits, plus shared DNA sequences. These common individualities are like species which share a recent common ancestor and can be used to rebuild the biological tree of life centered on radical connection with the help of fossils and species which still exist. The records from fossils comprise of progress from a biogenic graphite to microbial mat fossils to multicellular organisms. These prevailing arrays of biodiversity have been designed by extinction and speciation. Almost 99% of species which have roamed planet Earth are expected to be extinct. There have been about 10 to 14 million variety of species on Earth and 1.2 million only have been documented. Charles Darwin, in the middle of the 19th century, had verbalized a scientific theory of evolution by natural selection. His work became famous through this published book, On the Origin of Species, 1859. When more offspring are produced which can actually survive is termed as evolution by natural selection. There are three main facts about populaces. Behaviors differ among personages with respect to psychology, morphology and behavior. Various behaviors convene diverse rates of endurance and reproduction. Behaviors and traits can be passed down to generations. Therefore, in sequential generations, members of a certain populace are substituted by offspring of parents better adjusted to endure and breed in the biophysical atmosphere in which natural selection happens. The quality where the procedure of natural selection builds and conserves qualities which are fit for the practical parts they perform is teleonomy. Sexual and natural selection are the only identified source of adaptation, but are not the only reason of evolution. Mutation, gene migration and genetic drift are other non-adaptive procedures of evolution. The significance of natural selection as a reason of evolution has been recognized into other disciplines of biology. Earlier detained thoughts of evolution like evolutionism, orthogenesis and other principles on intrinsic progress contained by the largest scale drifts in evolution became outdated scientific philosophies. By founding and analyzing postulates, creating mathematical models of theoretical biology and biological philosophies, using observational data and executing experiments in laboratory and field, the scientists continue to study various traits of evolutionary biology. History of evolutionary thought. Although, while referring to evolution, it is often referred to as Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, the term actually goes back to the ancient Greece. The Greeks and medieval philosophers have described evolution as a state of nature in which they mention about how natural entirety has a motive. This can be thought of as nature through a technical sight. For instance, Aristotle had categorized all living organisms in a hierarchy, scala naturae, in which he has moved plants to lesser important animals to the humans at the top of the list. Philosophers like Augustine started to include these technical views with religion and said that God is the creator of all living beings and everything has a motive and a particular place as set by him. Elemental to natural selection is the thought of change by conjoint background. This infers that all organisms which are living are connected to one another, because any two species, if looked back, is found to have a common ancestor in the past. This is fundamentally a diverse interpretation than Aristotle's scala naturae, where every species is formed independently with its own motive and place in environment, and where no species evolves into new species. Evolution by natural selection is completely autonomous theory of transformation which doesn't quote any nows of motive or a designer. There is no premonition or persistence in nature, and there is no insinuation that one species is more flawless than another. There is only transformation compelled by miscellaneous compressions from the environs. Through the current theory of biological evolution by natural selection is established amid proficient biologists, there is still disagreement about if natural selection selects for fit organisms or fit genes or fit species. Darwin's theory doesn't stipulate genes account for an organism's genetic qualities, which is now anonymously recognized amongst contemporary evolutionists. Darwin was influenced by the works of Thomas Robert Malthus, An Essay on the Principle of Population, 1798. He noticed that growth in population would lead to a tussle for survival in which fortunate deviations conquered as others perished. In every generation, many progeny failed to subsist to an age of reproduction because of restricted means. This could elucidate the miscellany of animals and plants from a shared parentage through the operation of natural laws in the same manner for all forms of organisms. Thomas Henry Huxley used Darwin's thoughts to humans using comparative anatomy and paleontology, providing a proof that the humans and the apes shared a common heritage. Many were upset about the fact that the humans were not special in the universe. Exact mechanisms of multiplicity, variability, and the source of new characteristics continued to be unidentified. Darwin formed his theory of pangenesis, or the mechanism for heredity. Gregor Mendel testified in 1865 that the characteristics were inherited in an expectable manner through independent collection and classification of rudiments which later came to be known as genes. Mendel's laws of inheritance ultimately suppressed most of Darwin's theory of pangenesis. August Weismann's theory made a significant difference among somatic cells of the body and germ cells, which are responsible for gametes like egg cells and sperm, proving that heredity comes down only through the germ line. Hugo de Vries linked Darwin's theory of pangenesis to Weismann's cell differentiation and projected that Darwin's pangenes were concerted in the cell nucleus, and when articulated, they could travel into the cytoplasm and change the structure of the cells. Hugo de Vries was responsible to have made the theory of Mendel famous, as he believed that Mendel's characteristics related to the transfer of heredity alongside the germline. To describe how new variations create, de Vries made a mutation theory which led to transitory drift among those who follow the evolution of Darwin's theory and biometricians who trailed de Vries. Innovators in the field of population genetics like Sewell Wrightland, Ronald Fisher and J.B.S. Haldane set the basis of evolution on a much stronger numerical theory in the 1930s. Hence, the false opacity among genetic mutations, Darwin's theory and Mendelian inheritance was united. The Mendelian inheritance was united with mutation theory and evolutionary synthesis, linked natural selection in the 1920s and 1930s. This theory could be applied to any discipline of biology. This modern synthesis could elucidate designs perceived through species in populace through fossil transitions in paleontology and also compound cellular workings in developmental biology. Francis Crick and James Watson published The Structure of DNA in 1953, which revealed a physical working for inheritance. Understanding relationship between genotype and phenotype became easy because of molecular biology. There was much progress made in the discipline of phylogenetic systematics, which mapped the conversion of characteristics into a proportional and testable structure through the publishing and using evolutionary trees. Modern synthesis has now been expanded more to explicate biological occurrences through full and holistic gauge of biological hierarchy from genes to species. Charles Darwin, 12th of February 1809 to 19th of April 1882. Charles Darwin belonged to a rich British family and always showed interest in nature since he was a child. When he was studying botany at Cambridge University, he got a chance to work on HMS Beagle as a naturalist without pay. HMS Beagle was a ship which was on a voyage to explore the world. Darwin used this opportunity of 5 years to observe the plants and animals of the different places where the ship stopped, especially in the Galapagos Islands. He also collected many fossils for study. On his return to England in 1836, he started structuring his theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin kept his findings a secret for about 20 years, till a British naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, came up with his theory, which was much like Darwin's. It was then that Darwin announced about his theory, which he discovered decades back. Both the naturalists decided to publish the theory together. Both their findings were read by an association of naturalists on 1st of July 1858 in London. The next year, Darwin published his work on the origin of species in 1859, which immediately became the bestseller. Darwin's reasons for not publishing the book were religious criticism and scientific institution. Before Darwin had put forth his theory, there were many scientists who had debated about the evolving of animals. Some of his works include The Descent of Man, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, Selection in Relation to Sex, and the Formation of Vegetable Mold through the Actions of Worms. Darwin has been designated as one of the most influential individuals in the history of mankind. He was also honoured by burial in Westminster Abbey. Darwin's theory of evolution. According to Darwin, natural selection is the principle by which each slight variation of a trait, if useful, is preserved. The perception was simple yet powerful. Species that are best adapted to their surroundings will endure and multiply. As long as there is a little difference between and that variation can be inherited, there will be an unavoidable miscellany of entities with the most profitable variations. If the variants are inherited, then disparity multiplicative attainment will lead to an advanced evolution of specific populace of species, and populations which evolve to be adequately diverse ultimately become changed species. His thoughts were inspired completely by the observations which he made on his voyage on HMS Beagle and by works of Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, who was a political economist and wrote the book An Essay on the Principle of Population on 1798. The book described about the growing population and limited availability of food crops grown, the limited resources and the struggle for existence. Struck by this idea about how favourable changes would have to be saved while the unfavourable ones would have to be discarded in order to exist, which would give birth to new species, Darwin framed his theory of evolution. Darwin's book explains how species will change their powers and their physical being to survive and exist, and the cause could be any change in the surroundings and their habitats. Darwin called this principle of preservation natural selection. For Darwin and his equals, natural selection was in quintessence identical with evolution by natural selection. After the printing of On the Origin of Species, tasteful people largely believed that evolution had happened in some form. Nevertheless, natural selection continued to be continuous as a mechanism, partially as it was observed to be too frail to clarify the range of perceived individualities of living organisms, and somewhat because even cohorts of evolution hesitated at its untraced and non-progressive nature, a reaction that has been categorized as the solitary most substantial obstacle to the notion's reception. Nevertheless, some theorists willingly accepted natural selection after reading Darwin's theory. Herbert Spencer came up with the term survival of the fittest, which became a prevalent summary of the theory. The fifth edition of On the Origin of Species, published in 1869, comprised of Spencer's phrase as a substitute to natural selection. Proper credit was given to Spencer for this thought. Even though the phrase is habitually used by non-biologists, the modern biologists evade it because it is repetitious if fittest is meant functionally superior, and is used for individuals rather than deliberated as an averaged magnitude over populaces. Natural selection. Natural selection can be defined as the process through which various species adapt to their environment for survival and reproduction. It is one of the main mechanisms of evolution. The changes inheritable characteristics of a populace over a certain period of time. Charles Darwin propagated the word natural selection. He related it with artificial selection or selective breeding. Disparity subsists among all populations of organisms. This happens partially because random mutations happen in the genome of a particular organism and the young can inherit these types of mutations. Through the lives of entities, their genomes intermingle with their surroundings to cause differences in characteristics. The surrounding of a genome comprises of the molecular biology in the cells, other beings, species, populations, and abiotic environment. Beings with particular variations of the characteristic might endure and breed more than beings with other less effective changes. Hence, the population evolves. Factors that affect generative attainment are also vital, a problem which Darwin advanced in his thoughts on sexual selection and on fecundity selection. Natural selection acts on the phenotype or the noticeable traits of an organism, but the genetic source of any phenotype, which gives a breeding benefit, might become more common in a populace. With time, this procedure can result in populaces which focus for special ecological niches or microevolution and may in due course result in the advent of a new species also known as macroevolutions. Natural selection is an essential process through which evolution occurs within a populace of organisms. Natural selection can be compared with synthetic selection, in which humans purposely select certain characteristics. In natural selection, there is no deliberated selection. It can be also said that artificial selection is teleological and natural selection is not teleological, although teleological linguistic is mostly used by the biologists to explain it. Natural selection is one of the keystones of modern biology. The thought, published by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace in a combined demonstration of papers in 1858, was expanded in Darwin's impactful book on the origin of species, which explained natural selection as equivalent to artificial selection, a procedure through which plants and animals with characteristics thought to be desired by human breeders are methodically preferred for breeding. The thought of natural selection actually advanced in the absence of a proper theory of heredity. When Darwin was writing the theory, science was still undergoing development in theories of genetics. The unification of customary theory of Darwin's evolution with consequent findings in molecular and classical genetics is known as modern evolutionary synthesis. Natural selection continues to be the main explanation for adaptive evolution. General principles. Natural selection happens in the beings of any populace of organisms. Most of these variations don't upset the survival of reproduction, but there are a few dissimilarities which could better the odds of existence and reproduction of a specific being. A deer which runs fast will probably escape from its predators, and algae, which are more proficient in taking energy from sunlight, will grow quicker. Anything which upturns organisms' probabilities of endurance will frequently include its rate of reproduction. However, there are times when there could be a compromise between the survival and present reproduction. Finally, all that matters is the reproduction of organism throughout its life. In United Kingdom, a peppered moth comes in dark and light colours, but at the time of Industrial Revolution, most of the trees on which the moths sat became black by the soot. This became an advantage for the moths from the predators as they got a dark colour, and thus the darker moths were in a better position to reproduce. Their survival instincts increased, and within 50 years after the first dark moth was spotted, almost every moth which was caught in Manchester were dark. The balance was restored after the Clean Air Act of 1956, and spotting dark moths were exceptional, validating the effect of natural selection on peppered moth evolution. If the characteristics which give these beings a breeding benefit can also be inherited, which is taken by the young ones from their parents, then there will be a little more ratio of fast rabbits or proficient algae in the coming generation. This is termed as differential reproduction. Even if the reproductive benefit is very less, with time and after many generations, this heritable advantage becomes dominant in the populace. The characteristics which convene a reproductive advantage which causes steady changes or evolution of life is selected by the natural environment of an organism. Charles Darwin was the first to explain and name this effect. The theory of natural selection precedes the perception of genetics, the working of heredity for all types of life forms. Presently, choosing behaves on an organism's phenotype or noticeable individualities, but it is the genotype which is actually inherited. The phenotype is the outcome of genotype and the surrounding in which the living being is staying. This is the connection between genetics and natural selection as explained in the modern evolutionary synthesis. Even though a full theory of evolution also needs a justification of how genetic differences come up, by sexual production or mutation, and comprises of other evolutionary mechanisms like gene flow and genetic drift, natural selection happens to be the most significant mechanism for generating complex adaptations in environment. Nomenclature and usage. There are different definitions which have been used in various contexts to describe natural selections. Mostly, it is described to operate on inheritable attributes, as these are the attributes which unswervingly partake in evolution. Natural selection which detects alterations in phenotype can give a reproductive benefit irrespective of whether the attribute can be inherited or not. It has also been sometimes termed as blind. According to Darwin's usage, the word is normally used to denote both the evolutionary result of blind selection and to its workings. At times it aids in differentiating between the effect and mechanism of the selection. When distinction is vital, scientists describe natural selection precisely as those mechanisms which assist in the selection of beings which reproduce, without concern to if the base of selection is inheritable. At times, this is also known as phenotype natural selection. Attributes which ground superior reproductive success of a living being is selected for, while those which lessen the rate of success are selected against. Choosing a trait might also result in the selection of additional interrelated attributes which don't impact the reproductive benefit directly. This could happen as a consequence of gene linkage or pleiotropy. Fitness. The theory of fitness is essential to natural selection. Beings which are more fit have superior chances of surviving, but the specific meaning of the word is more refined if compared to the description of natural selection in the above explanation. Theory of fitness is defined not by the age of an organism, but by how fruitful it is at breeding. If a living being has half the life in comparison to any other living being, but multiplies double in who survive adulthood, then its genes will be more common in the adult populace of the coming generation. Although natural selection performs on entities, the impacts of chance means fitness can be described on an average for entities within a populace. The fitness of a certain genotype agrees to the effect on all entities of that genotype. Genotypes with low fitness cause their carriers to have less or no young ones. To take an example, there could be a number of human genetic disorders such as phenylketonuria and sickle cell anemia. Fitness is an average quantity, and it is also likely that an encouraging mutation happens in an entity which doesn't last till its adulthood for discrete causes. Fitness is also influenced by the environment. Disorders such as sickle cell anemia might have low fitness in common human populace, but since the sickle cell characteristic converses susceptibly to malaria, it also has high fitness value in populace who are highly infected by malaria. Types of selection. Natural selection can perform on any heritable phenotype attribute, and discerning force can be made by any trait of the surrounding, with sexual selection and opposition with associates of the similar or different species. This does not suggest that natural selection is always maneuvering and consequences in adaptive evolution. Natural selection mostly upshots in the conversation of the status in by disagreeing the lesser fitting characteristics. Outcomes on an attribute can help in categorization of selection. Stabilizing selection performs to clench an attribute at a steady optimal, and in the unpretentious case, all deviances from this optimal are selectively unfavorable. Directional selection acts through conversion phases, when the present type of attribute is suboptimal and corrects the attributes towards a single new optimal. Disruptive selection acts at the time of conversion when the present mode is suboptimal, but changes the attribute in more than one direction. Exacting, if the attribute is computable and univariate, then both higher and lower attribute stages are preferred. Disruptive selection can be termed as a predecessor to speciation. Selection can be categorized according to the effect on occurrence of allele. Positive selection acts to upsurge the occurrence of an allele. Negative selection acts to lessen the occurrence of an allele. In case of diallelic locus, positive selection on one allele inevitably denotes negative selection on the other allele. Selection can also be categorized as per the effect on genetic diversity. Purifying selection acts to eliminate genetic difference from the populace. Balancing selection acts to uphold genetic difference in a populace. Workings comprise of negative frequency reliant on selection and altitudinal or chronological changeability in the power and course of selection. Selection can also be categorized as per the stage of an organism's life cycle at which it acts. The practice of term is different here. Many see only two types of selection: viability selection, which acts to develop the possibility of existence of the organism, and fecundity selection, which acts to better the rate of breeding provided it is give a fruitful endurance. Others divide the life cycle into additional constituents of selection. Thus, feasibility and existence selection might be described distinctly and discretely as acting to better the prospect of endurance before and after multiplicative age is attained, while fecundity selection might be divided into more sub-constituents together with sexual selection, compatibility selection, and gametic selection. Selection can be categorized conferring to the level or unit of selection. Gene selection acts unswervingly at the level of the gene. In many circumstances, this is a diverse method of explaining individual selection. In many situations, the gene-level selection offers more appropriate clarification of the fundamental procedure. Group selection acts at the stage of cluster of organisms. The working presumes that cluster duplicate and mutate in an equivalent manner to genes and beings. There is an unending dispute over the degree to which the group selection happens in nature. Selection can also be classified as per the source being contended for. Sexual selection consequences from opposition for companions. Sexual selection can be intrasexual, as in circumstances of rivalry between beings of the same sex in a populace, or intersexual, as in situations where one sex regulates reproductive gain by selecting among populace of accessible companions. Characteristically, sexual selection ensues through fecundity selection at the cost of feasibility at times. Ecological selection is natural selection through additional ways than sexual selection. On the other hand, natural selection is many times described as indistinguishable with ecological selection, and sexual selection is then categorized as a different mechanism to natural selection. This agrees with Darwin's usage of these words, but snubs the statement that competition for companion and companion selection are natural procedures. Ecological selection shields any mechanism of selection as a consequence of the surrounding including relations. Examples of natural selection. A famous example of natural selection in act is progress of antibiotic resistance in microorganisms. After the finding of penicillin in 1928, antibiotics have been helpful in fighting bacterial sicknesses. Amid the many individual members, natural populaces of bacteria consist of substantial disparity in their genetic material, mainly as a consequence of mutations. Most bacteria die rapidly if opened to antibiotics, but some might have mutations which make them less vulnerable. If the contact with antibiotic is short, these beings will live on through the curing process. This selective eradication of such adapted beings from a populace is natural selection. These bacteria which endure multiply and produce the coming generation. As the maladapted beings were tried to be eradicated in the past generation, the next populace having the bacteria would be a little resistant against the antibiotic. New mutations happen simultaneously, giving new genetic difference to the present genetic difference. Extemporaneous mutations hardly occur, and advantageous mutations are scarcer. Nevertheless, the bacteria populace is big enough for some beings to have favourable mutation. If a new mutation lessens their vulnerability to one antibiotic, they are probable to endure if they face the same antibiotic again. With time and continuous contact with the antibiotic will ultimately make a populace of bacteria antibiotic resistant. This new changes populace of bacteria, which is resistant to the antibiotic, is successfully adjusted to the environment it involved in. It is not compulsory to successfully adapt to any more to the old antibiotic-free surrounding. The consequence of natural selection is two populaces which are both desirably adjusted to their precise surrounding, while both execute subnormal in other surroundings. The extensive use and abuse of antibiotics has led to an unpraised microbial resistance to antibiotics in medical use, to a point that methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, has been explained as a superbug as it stands its hazard to fitness and its comparative immunity to prevailing drugs. Reaction approaches characteristically comprise of the use of various, more powerful antibiotics. Conversely, new strains of MRSA have lately appeared which are resilient even to these drugs. In evolutionary arms race, bacteria carry on developing strains which are less vulnerable to antibiotics, while clinical researchers carry on developing newer forms of antibiotics which can eliminate them. An alike condition happens with pesticide resistance in insects and plants. Arms races are not always encouraged by humans. For instance, a documented example includes the spread of a gene in the Hippolymus bolina butterfly, which destroyed male-killing action by Wolbachia bacteria parasite on the island of Soma, where this widespread of gene had happened in a term of just 5 years. Evolution by means of natural selection. A precondition for natural selection to outcome in adjusted evolution, original individualities and speciation, is the existence of transmissible genetic variant which consequences in fitness alterations. Genetic variation is the outcome of mutations, genetic recombinations and modifications in the karyotype. The shape, size, number and internal structure of the chromosomes. Any of these vicissitudes could have an influence which is extremely beneficial or vastly unfavourable, but great effects are very infrequent. In the past, most variations in the genetic material were deliberated non-aligned or near to non-aligned as they happened in non-coding DNA, or its consequence was a synonymous substitution. Still, current studies propose that several mutations in non-coding DNA do have little harmful effects. Though both mutation rates and normal fitness effects of mutations are reliant on the organism, approximations from statistics in humans have established that a majority of mutations are somewhat harmful. By the meaning of fitness, entities with better fitness are further probable to subside progeny to the next generation, while entities with slighter fitness are more expected to perish quickly or be unsuccessful to breed. As an outcome, alleles that on average outcome in better fitness develop more plentiful in the coming generation, while alleles that in overall decrease fitness develop scarcer. If the selection criteria continue to be similar for coming generations, useful alleles grow into plentiful till they dictate the populace, while alleles with a slighter fitness vanish. In each generation, new mutations and recombinations ascend impulsively, creating a fresh range of phenotypes. So every new generation will be augmented by the growing profusion of alleles, which add to those individualities which were preferred by selection, increasing these individualities above succeeding generations. Few mutations happen in supposed monitoring genes. Variations in these can have huge effects on the phenotype of the bean, as they control the function of many other genes. Maximum but not all, mutations in controlling genes outcome in non-feasible zygotes. Illustrations of non-lethal controlling mutations happen in Hox genes in human beings that can outcome in a cervical rib, or polydactyly, an upsurge in the number of toes or fingers. When such mutations outcome in an advanced fitness, natural selection will help these phenotypes and the original characteristic will spread in the populace. Recognized individualities are not unchangeable. Individualities which have great fitness in one ecological setting might be much lesser fit if ecological circumstances alter. In the absence of natural selection to preserve such a characteristic, will get more adaptable and worsen with time, perhaps causing in a useless expression of the attribute also known as evolutionary baggage. In many situations, the seemingly useless construction may preserve a restricted functionality or may be designated for other beneficial behaviors in an occurrence called pre-adaptation. An eminent example of a vestigial structure is the eye of the blind mole rat, is supposed to preserve purpose in photo-period insight. Speciation. Speciation needs a stop in the flow of the gene which consequences from reproductive isolation. With time, isolated subgroups could deviate profoundly and become various other species, either because of variations in selection stresses on the various subgroups or because the various mutations rise unexpectedly in different populaces or because of genetic drift which is accountable for occurrences like founder effect and bottleneck effect. Known by few, mechanism of speciation happens through hybridization, which has been documented in plants and also seen in animals like cichlid fish. This type of mechanism of rapid selection can reveal mechanism of evolutionary change termed as punctuated equilibrium, which proposes that evolutionary change and specifically speciation usually occurs quickly after interjecting long times of equilibrium. Charles Darwin took 20 years to present to the world what he had discovered. His religious and scientific fears were not wrong. The book was a rage in the market, and although rejected by many, most of them accepted the book and his theory of evolution. There are scientists who still debate about his theory of evolution, but in the end it clearly comes to that Darwin is right. There have been many inclusions and further studies which have been added to his theory, but Darwin continues to be the founder of the theory of evolution. His book on the origin of species continues to attract millions of readers till date. History of evolutionary thought. Although, while referring to evolution, it is often referred to as Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, the term actually goes back to the ancient Greece. The Greeks and medieval philosophers have described evolution as a state of nature in which they mention about how natural entirety has a motive. This can be thought of as nature through a technical sight. For instance, Aristotle had categorized all living organisms in a hierarchy, scala naturae, in which he has moved plants to lesser important animals to the humans at the top of the list. Philosophers like Augustine started to include these technical views with religion and said that God is the creator of all living beings and everything has a motive and a particular place as set by him. Elemental to natural selection is the thought of change by conjoined background. This infers that all organisms which are living are connected to one another, because any two species, if looked back, is found to have a common ancestor in the past, to endure and breed in the biophysical atmosphere in which natural selection happens. The quality where the procedure of natural selection builds and conserves qualities which are fit for the practical parts they perform is teleonomy. Sexual and natural selection are the only identified source of adaptation, but are not the only reason of evolution. Mutation, gene migration, and genetic drift are other non-adaptive procedures of evolution. The significance of natural selection as a reason of evolution has been recognized into other disciplines of biology. Earlier detained thoughts of evolution like evolutionism, orthogenesis, and other principles on intrinsic progress contained by the largest scale drifts in evolution became outdated scientific philosophies. By founding and analyzing postulates, creating mathematical models of theoretical biology and biological philosophies, using observational data and executing experiments in laboratory and field, the scientists continue to study various traits of evolutionary biology. This is fundamentally a diverse interpretation than Aristotle's scala naturae, where every species forms independently with its own motive and place in environment, and where no species evolves into new species. Evolution by natural selection is completely autonomous theory of transformation, which doesn't quote any nows of motive or a designer. There is no premonition or persistence in nature, and there is no insinuation that one species is more flawless than another. There is only transformation compelled by miscellany compressions from the environs. Through the current theory of biological evolution by natural selection is established amid proficient biologists, there is still disagreement about if natural selection selects for fit organisms or fit genes or fit species. Darwin's theory doesn't stipulate genes account for an organism's genetic qualities, which is now anonymously recognized amongst contemporary evolutionists. Darwin was influenced by the works of Thomas Robert Malthus, an essay on the principle of population, 1798. He noticed that growth in population In a recent study in 2015, the scientists found remains of biotic life in a few historic rocks, Western Australia, which dated back to 4.1 billion years ago, and on July 2016, the scientists confirmed about 355 genes which were from LUCA of all the living organisms on Earth. Formation, change and loss of species through the evolutionary antiquity of life on Earth are validated by common sets of biochemical and morphological traits, plus shared DNA sequences. These common individualities are like species which share a recent common ancestor and can be used to rebuild the biological tree of life centered on radical connection with the help of fossils and species which still exist. The records from fossils comprise of progress from a biogenic graphite to microbial mat fossils to multicellular organisms. These prevailing arrays of biodiversity have been designed by extinction and speciation. Almost 99% of species which have roamed planet Earth are expected to be extinct. There have been about 10 to 14 million variety of species on Earth, and 1.2 million only have been documented. Charles Darwin, in the middle of the 19th century, had verbalized a scientific theory of evolution by natural selection. His work became famous through this published book, On the Origin of Species, 1859. When more offspring are produced which can actually survive is termed as evolution by natural selection. There are three main facts about populaces. Behaviors differ among personages with respect to psychology, morphology, and behavior. Various behaviors convene diverse rates of endurance and reproduction. Behaviors and traits can be passed down to generations. Therefore, in sequential generations, members of a certain populace are substituted by offspring of parents better adjusted